Part 1. The Welcome That Wasn't. The transport ship smelled like recycled air and cheap coffee. Laura Devon didn't mind. She had grown up in a small house in Dayton, Ohio, where the heat broke every summer and the windows never quite closed all the way, so she already knew how to be comfortable in places that weren't designed for comfort. She sat in the back of the passenger hold with her bag between her feet and her eyes on the viewport, watching the stars slide past like they didn't care about any of this. She was 24 years old. She had passed every exam they put in front of her, and in roughly 6 hours, she was going to be one of the first humans to train at a Galactic Consortium facility. She told herself it didn't feel like a big deal. She was lying. Danny Cole was sitting 2 seats over, eating something from a foil pack and talking to nobody in particular about how he couldn't believe the food packs had gotten worse since the last transit. He was from outside Savannah, Georgia, had a wide, easy smile, and somehow made every room feel slightly more relaxed just by being in it. Laura had met him at the orientation briefing 3 weeks ago and had immediately liked him in the way you like someone who never seems to be performing anything. Priya Okafor sat near the front, reading from a console screen, occasionally making small marks in the margin of whatever she was studying. She had come in first on the general intake exams, and she knew it, though not in an unpleasant way. She was just a person who was good at things and had spent enough of her life knowing it that it had stopped being a source of excitement and become more like a fact. There were 9 humans total on the transport. Laura didn't know all of them well yet. She figured she would soon enough. Kareth Station appeared in the viewport slowly, the way big things always do. First just a shape, then a structure, then something almost impossible to take in all at once. It orbited a pale orange gas giant at the edge of a system Laura couldn't pronounce. It was enormous. It had been built by 4 different species over 200 years, and it showed, the way old cities show their layers. One section all hard angles, another with curved walls that seemed grown rather than built, another that rotated slowly and caught the light in ways that made Laura's eyes take a second to adjust. The docking process took a long time. There were forms, there were health scans. There was a brief but thorough period where a consortium official reviewed their credentials with an expression that suggested it was finding the whole situation mildly inconvenient. Laura waited. She was good at waiting. Their assigned quarters were clean and simple. The hallways were wide, which she appreciated, because the first time she stepped into the main corridor and saw 3 different alien species moving past her at once, tall, short, one that moved in a way she couldn't immediately categorize, she needed a little extra space to process that without showing it on her face. The first class was the next morning. Instructor Vale was already in the room when the human cohort arrived. Laura noticed her before she said anything, which felt important later. Vale was Velhari, tall, with pale gray skin and large dark eyes that moved with a precision that was a little unsettling if you weren't ready for it. She stood at the front of the room the way some people stand in rooms, like the room had been arranged around her and not the other way around. She looked at the 9 humans filing in and said nothing for a moment that was slightly too long to be accidental. Then she said in clean and perfect English that she was glad they had arrived safely and that the program would begin immediately. She was not glad. Laura could tell. She wasn't sure how she could tell exactly. Something in the timing of the words. Something in the way Vale's eyes moved across the group without stopping on any of them. The first session was mostly information. Protocols, safety procedures, a breakdown of how the joint training program would run over the next 3 months. Vale delivered all of it in a tone that was polite and precise and completely empty of anything that suggested she found any of this interesting. Then Vale asked the group a question, a theoretical one, about decision-making under resource scarcity. It was the kind of question that had multiple reasonable answers, and Vale presented it that way. Laura answered. Her answer was clear and well-reasoned. She had thought about questions like this before, had read a fair amount on the subject, and what she said was genuinely good. Vale looked at her for a moment, nodded once, and said it was an interesting response. That was all she said. But then she turned slightly toward the section of the room where the non-human students were seated. a mix of 3 other species who had their own programs overlapping with the human cohort, and she said something, in the alien common tongue, quickly and quietly, not looking at the humans. Laura caught maybe half of it. Her Velhari was almost nothing at that point, just a few dozen words she had picked up from a language file on the transit ship out of simple curiosity. But she caught enough to understand that whatever Vale had said was not a translation of the nod. She didn't react. She kept her face the way she kept it when the heat broke in Dayton and there was nothing to do about it. She looked at her console screen and wrote down the words she had caught, phonetically as best she could remember them. She didn't know yet what all of them meant. She decided she was going to find out. That night, while Danny Cole was trying to figure out if the food in the consortium cafeteria could be made better with hot sauce, and Priya Okafor was already 3 chapters into a Velhari structural grammar guide, Laura Devon started learning a language. She wasn't angry. She wasn't scared. She was paying attention. That was usually enough. Part 2. The Architecture of Small Cruelties. The second week was when things started to change. It happened slowly, the way a room gets cold. Not all at once, but in small degrees that you almost don't notice until you realize you've been uncomfortable for a while and you just stopped expecting anything different. Vale's teaching style settled into a pattern. Every session began the same way. A question, an answer, a response from Vale that was technically polite and somehow made the person who answered feel like they had said the wrong thing even when they hadn't. She never raised her voice. She never said anything that could be clearly pointed to as cruel. She just had a way of receiving answers that made them feel smaller than they were when they left your mouth. Danny Cole noticed it first, in the way he noticed most things. Not analytically, but instinctively, the way you notice weather before you can name it. After the 3rd session, he told Laura over dinner that he kept second-guessing himself in class now, going over his answers in his head afterward and finding problems with all of them, even when he had been confident walking in. He said it in a light way, because that was how Danny said most things, but Laura heard the edge underneath it. Priya Okafor's change was different, and in some ways harder to watch. She had come in sure of herself in a way that was clean and earned, not arrogant. By the end of the 2nd week, she was explaining her answers before she gave them, laying out all the reasons why she might be wrong before she even got to what she actually thought. It was the opposite of how she had been before. It was like watching someone apologize for taking up space in a room they had every right to be in. The other cadets were quieter, too. Not all at once, just a little less than before. Vale was running simulations by then. They were called assessment scenarios in the program documentation, and the description made them sound like standard decision-making exercises. They were not standard. Laura figured that out by the 3rd one. The simulations were personalized. That was the thing. Each one was built around the specific history of the cadet running it, their background, their failures, the things they had written about in their intake forms under sections with titles like Personal Challenges and Formative Experiences. Vale had access to all of it, and she had used it. Danny's scenarios kept putting him in situations where his instincts led to outcomes that hurt people he was trying to help. Not because the scenarios were realistic, but because they were designed to make his natural way of moving through problems look like a liability. After each one, Vale would review the results in front of the group in that same polite tone, pointing out the moments where things went wrong, always framing it as data rather than criticism, which somehow made it worse. Priya's scenarios were different. Hers put her in situations where her best solutions were technically correct, but arrived too late or communicated badly, making her watch the consequences of being right in a way that didn't matter. It was precise. Whoever had designed the simulation parameters knew exactly which specific kind of failure would land hardest for a person like Priya. Laura ran her own scenarios. She did not come out of them feeling good, but she noticed something. Hers were less targeted than the others. Vale's files on her were thinner, maybe, or something about Laura's profile was harder to build a precise wound around. Whatever the reason, Laura came out of her simulations tired and frustrated, but not hollowed out the way Danny and Priya were starting to look. She kept her log. It was a plain document on her personal console, not connected to any consortium network. She wrote down everything: the timing of Vale's praise and where it landed in a session, the specific structure of how she framed questions so that any answer sounded like a partial failure, the relationship between what was in a cadet's intake file and what turned up in their simulations 3 days later. She wrote it in plain language, without conclusions, just patterns. She had learned early that conclusions made you stop looking. Patterns kept you watching. By the end of the second week, she had 4 pages. She took those 4 pages to Commander Ellie Park. Park was the human liaison officer on Kareth Station, a careful man in his 40s from somewhere in New Mexico who had the particular manner of someone who had spent a long time navigating situations where saying the wrong thing had real consequences. He listened to everything Laura said. He read through her log. He sat with it for a moment. Then he told her that Vale's methods, while intense, were considered among the most respected in the consortium's training system. Species had been sending their best candidates to Vale for decades. The Velhari approach to psychological conditioning was documented and approved at the highest levels of the academic board. And humanity's position in the consortium was still new, still being watched, still fragile in ways that Laura might not fully appreciate from where she was sitting. He said he was sorry. He said it like he meant it, which almost made it worse. Laura walked back to her quarters in the long, quiet corridor that smelled faintly of something mineral she had never been able to identify. She sat on the edge of her bunk. She thought about Danny's face at dinner and Priya explaining herself before she even had a thought to explain. She opened her Velhari language file. She had been at it for 10 days. She was already past the basic structure, into the grammar patterns that made the language difficult. The way Velhari sentences held their meaning in the relationship between words rather than in the words themselves, so that you could know every word in a sentence and still miss what it was saying if you didn't understand how they were sitting next to each other. It was not an easy language. She kept going. By the end of Part 2, she could read simple Velhari text without stopping to check references. She could follow spoken Velhari if it wasn't too fast. She was still making errors, but the errors were getting smaller. More importantly, she had started going back to the consortium's public academic archive and looking up Velhari educational theory. There was a lot of it. It was dense and dry and written for an audience that already understood Velhari psychology from the inside. She read it anyway. She was looking for something specific. She wasn't sure what it was yet. She found it on a Tuesday night, 3 hours after everyone else in the cohort had gone to sleep, in a paper written 400 years ago by a Velhari psychologist whose name she practiced pronouncing until she could say it without stumbling. She read the relevant section twice. Then she closed the console, lay back on her bunk, and looked at the ceiling for a while. She now knew exactly what Vale was doing. She knew the name of it. She knew where it came from. She knew how it was supposed to end. She also knew from the same paper the one thing the method required in order to work. The subject could not know they were inside it. Laura Devon was very much inside it, and now she knew. It was a Wednesday morning when Vale called Laura to the front of the room. The other cadets went quiet in a particular way, not the quiet of people waiting for something good, but the quiet of people who recognize a shape they have seen before and don't want to be noticed near it. The alien students in the overlapping section of the room shifted slightly. A few of them exchanged looks that Laura couldn't fully read yet, but had learned to notice. She had seen this done to other students in other programs on the station. She had asked one of the alien cadets about it quietly a few days earlier, a young Velhari student named Soren, who had been more willing to talk to the humans than most. Soren had explained it in careful, simple words, like someone trying to be kind while delivering information that wasn't kind at all. It was called a public individual assessment in the formal program language. In the way Velhari students talked about it among themselves, it had a shorter name that translated roughly as the open unmaking. It was designed to look like a teaching moment. It was designed to feel like one too at first. The instructor would ask questions that seemed reasonable. The student would answer. The instructor would respond in ways that were technically neutral, but structurally built to make every answer feel like it had revealed a flaw. It could go on for as long as the instructor wanted, and because it was framed as instruction, the student had no clean way to push back without appearing to refuse to learn. Laura walked to the front of the room. She stood where Vale indicated, which was slightly too far from the instructor's console and slightly too close to the center of the room, so that she was visible from every seat. She noticed the positioning. She filed it away. Vale began in English, which was considerate in the way a trap can be considerate. The first few questions were about resource allocation theory, a topic from the previous week's coursework. Laura answered them well. Vale received each answer with a small nod and a pause that lasted just long enough to make the answer feel uncertain, even though it hadn't been. Then Vale switched to the alien common tongue. She didn't announce the switch, she just did it, mid-sentence, as though it were natural. And for everyone in the room except the human cadets, it was natural. It was the language of the station, the language of the consortium, the language that everyone was expected to understand eventually. The human cadets were not expected to understand it yet. That was the point. Vale's voice in the common tongue was smoother than in English. She spoke the way people speak when they are in their element, and what she said, clearly in full sentences, without lowering her voice, was that this was a demonstration of something she had been observing for several weeks. She said that the human cadets showed a remarkable ability to appear capable within the narrow bandwidth of their own language, and that watching Laura answer questions was an instructive example of how confidence and competence could occupy the same space without actually being connected. She said it pleasantly. That was the thing that made the alien students go still. Then she turned back to Laura and asked in English whether Laura had anything to add to her last answer. Laura looked at her for a moment. Then Laura answered in Velhari, not the common tongue. Velhari, Vale's own language. The one nobody on that station outside the Velhari students would have expected a human to be anywhere near fluent in after 6 weeks. The room did something that had no sound attached to it. It was a shift, physical almost. Danny Cole later said it felt like the air in the room changed temperature. Laura's Velhari was not perfect. She knew that. There were edges in her pronunciation that a native speaker would catch. But the grammar was correct. The structure was right, and every word landed where she intended it. She said that she appreciated the question and that she did have something to add. She said that she recognized what was happening. She used the full formal name for it, the reflective diminishment protocol, developed by the Velhari psychologist Sorvan in the 4th century of the Velhari academic tradition, documented in his collected papers on psychological conditioning in educational environments, Volume 3, Chapter 9. She said it calmly, not loudly, not with anger, just as a fact, the way you state the name of something you have taken the time to learn properly. Vale did not move. Laura continued. She explained, still in Velhari, that the protocol was built on a single necessary condition. The subject had to be unaware that they were inside a constructed framework. Sorvan had written this himself in the same chapter. He had called it the load-bearing wall of the entire method. Without it, the protocol did not condition the subject. It only demonstrated to the subject how the method worked, which was a different thing entirely and not useful to the instructor at all. She said this without triumph in her voice. She wasn't performing, she was just saying what was true. Then she did the thing that nobody in the room had been expecting, including herself, until the moment she decided to do it. She stopped talking about the protocol. She looked at Vale directly and said, still in Velhari, that she understood why the method existed. She said the Velhari had built it because they needed a way to test whether a student could hold themselves together under pressure that came from inside rather than outside. She said that was a real and serious thing to want to know about a person. Then she said that the reason it wasn't working, not on her and not the way Vale intended on the others, was that most of the humans in this cohort had already had their fracture points tested. Not in a simulation, not in a room with a controlled outcome, in actual life. in the kind of situations where nobody was running parameters and there was no review session afterward. She didn't dramatize it, she just named a few things plainly. The kind of loss that doesn't get filed under formative experience because it's too ordinary to be called that. The kind of failure that doesn't show up as a data point because it happened quietly, at home, in the middle of a Tuesday with no audience. She said that when real life has already broken something in you and you put it back together yourself, a simulation designed to find the break doesn't find anything new. It just finds the scar. And a scar is not a fracture point. It is the place that is now harder than everything around it. She stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Vale stood at the front with her large, dark eyes on Laura and said nothing for a span of time that felt significant even by Velhari standards. And Soren told Laura later that among Velhari, extended silence from an instructor after a student speaks was not nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. Danny Cole was looking at his console screen with an expression that suggested he was trying very hard not to show any expression at all. Priya Okafor had put her stylus down. Laura stood in the center of the room and waited because she was good at waiting, and because she had said everything she had to say and there was nothing useful in adding to it. Vale said finally in English that the session was concluded. That was all she said. Laura walked back to her seat. She sat down. She opened her console to the next module and started reading. Her hands were steady. She had not known they would be until just now. An alien instructor played mind games. She answered with a truth that hurt more. Part 4. What the Truth Costs. Nobody talked about it directly that afternoon. That was the thing Laura noticed first. After the session ended and the cohort moved into their afternoon modules, nobody came up to her in the hallway and said, "What you did was incredible," or, "I can't believe that happened." Danny gave her a look when they passed in the corridor. A specific look, the kind that carries a full conversation in it without needing any words, and then went back to whatever he was carrying. Priya walked beside her for about 30 seconds in silence and then said, quietly, that she had understood maybe a third of what Laura said in Velhari and that she intended to fix that. Then she walked ahead. That was it. That was the whole celebration. Laura found that she didn't mind. It felt right somehow. The kind of thing that had happened in that room didn't need noise around it. It needed space. What it got instead was consequences. Commander Eli Park called her in the next morning. His office on Kareth Station was small and functional, with a viewport that looked out on the far side of the station's structure rather than the stars, which Laura had always thought said something about the job. He was sitting behind his desk when she arrived, and he had the look of a man who had spent the night thinking about something and had not arrived at a comfortable conclusion. He told her that 3 senior members of the consortium academic board had flagged the session. Flagged was the word he used, carefully, without specifying whether flagged meant something good or something that was going to become a problem. He said there was going to be a formal review of the simulation parameters used in the human cohort's training program. He said the review had been requested by the board members themselves, not by the Human Liaison Office, which he seemed to want her to understand was a meaningful distinction. Laura said she understood. Park looked at her for a moment. Then he said there was something else. Instructor Vale had requested a private meeting with Laura. The room was quiet for a second. Laura asked if she had to go. Park said no. He said it was a request, not a requirement, and that she was under no obligation and that he would support whatever she decided. He said this in a way that suggested he genuinely meant it, which she appreciated. She told him she would go. Park nodded slowly. He looked like he wanted to say something else and then decided against it. As she was leaving, he told her, without looking up from his desk, that whatever happened in that meeting, she should know that what she had done in the session had already been seen by people with more influence in the consortium than either of them. He said that carefully, too. She thanked him and left. The meeting with Vale was that evening. Vale's private office was nothing like Laura had expected, which she realized afterward was foolish. She hadn't known what to expect and had invented something anyway. It was a plain room, clean and ordered, with a low shelf of physical documents along one wall, and a single large viewport showing the gas giant outside, its pale orange surface moving in slow, enormous patterns that made everything else in the room feel very small. Vale was standing when Laura arrived. She didn't sit down for the first part of the conversation, and neither did Laura. Vale did not apologize. Laura had not expected her to exactly, but she had thought there might be some version of it. A Velhari equivalent, a formal acknowledgement. There wasn't. What Vale did instead was stand with her hands at her sides and look at Laura with those precise, dark eyes and say, in careful English, that she had a question. Laura said she was listening. Vale asked how humans did it. She paused, then made the question more specific. She said she had reviewed human biological and psychological data for years before the cohort arrived. She said she understood the parameters: short lives, perfect memory, emotional systems that were inconsistent by any measurable standard, cognitive processes that were heavily influenced by physical state, social factors, and variables that couldn't be controlled for. She said that by every metric her training and tradition had given her, humans should not be well suited to the kind of sustained learning that the consortium's program required. Then she said, quietly, that every human in the cohort was still here. She said other species had lost students in this program, not to anything dangerous, just to the weight of it, the pressure, the accumulated effect of being pushed past a certain point. She said the Velhari method had a calculated attrition rate built into it, because some percentage of students breaking was considered evidence that the method was working at full capacity. Not one human had broken. She asked again, how? Laura thought about it. She didn't rush the answer because the question deserved not to be rushed. She said she didn't think she could give Vale a clean answer because she didn't think there was one. She said she couldn't speak for every person in the cohort, only from what she knew about herself and what she had observed in the others. She said that humans lived with a specific kind of knowledge from very early on, that things end, that effort doesn't always produce the outcome you worked for, that the people you love will not always be there, and that you will fail at things that matter to you. She said humans didn't learn this in a controlled environment. They learned it while it was happening, without warning, without a debrief afterward. She said that didn't make humans strong in any simple way. She said plenty of humans broke under pressure and stayed broken. She wasn't making a claim about the species. She was just saying that by the time most people reached adulthood, they had already carried something heavy for a long time. And carrying something heavy for a long time changed the way your body understood weight. It didn't disappear. You just became someone who had already done it. She said the cohort wasn't unbreakable. They were just people who had already been broken once and had found out that the morning still came after. Vale listened to all of it without moving, without interrupting, without the small, precise nods she used in class to perform attention while withholding it. When Laura finished, Vale was quiet for a long moment. Then she said in Velhari, just 2 words. Laura knew them both. Together they meant something close to, I see, not I understand, not I agree, just I see. It was the most honest thing Vale had said to her since they met. Laura walked back to the human quarters through the long, mineral-smelling corridor. She passed the cafeteria where Danny was eating something he was almost certainly about to complain about, and Priya was at a corner table with her Velhari grammar guide and a cup of something hot. The station hummed around her the way large structures hum, low and constant, like it was reminding itself it was still there. She sat down across from Danny. He looked at her and said, "Well?" She said, "I think it went okay." He offered her something from his food pack. It was bad. She ate it anyway. Outside the viewport, the gas giant turned slowly in the dark, enormous and indifferent, and somehow tonight, not entirely unwelcoming. The last month of the program was different. Not easier, exactly. Vale did not suddenly become warm or begin treating the sessions like a pleasant gathering. The work was still hard, and the expectations were still high, and Vale still had a way of standing in a room that made you feel like the room belonged to her, and you were a guest who had not yet proven you deserved to be there. None of that changed. But something underneath it changed. The simulations were adjusted. Nobody announced it. There was no formal statement from Vale or from the academic board. The scenarios simply started to feel like they were testing something real rather than searching for a specific wound. Danny ran a simulation in the 5th week that put his instincts to work rather than against him, and he came out of it quiet in a different way than before. Not hollowed out, but thoughtful. The way a person gets quiet when something has confirmed rather than undermined what they believed about themselves. Priya stopped pre-explaining her answers. She just gave them, clean and direct, the way she had in the beginning. The other alien cadets in the overlapping program started sitting closer to the human cohort during shared sessions. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a gradual rearrangement, the kind that happens when people stop treating a boundary as necessary. Soren, the young Velhari student who had explained the open unmaking to Laura weeks earlier, started eating in the cafeteria at the same time as the humans. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just occupied the same space, which was its own kind of thing. Laura kept going with her Velhari. She was genuinely good at it now, not fluent in the way a native speaker was fluent, but functional in a way that had stopped feeling like work and started feeling like a tool she actually owned. She used it in sessions sometimes when Vael asked a question that she wanted to answer precisely, because Velhari was a more precise language for certain kinds of ideas than English was, and Vael would receive those answers with the same stillness she had shown in the private meeting, that particular quality of attention that wasn't performing anything. The review by the Consortium Academic Board concluded 3 weeks before the end of the program. The results were not published in full, but Commander Park told Laura what he could. The intake files would be sealed from instructors going forward across all programs, not just the human cohort. The simulation parameters would be revised according to new guidelines that emphasized assessment over targeted exposure. The changes would apply consortium-wide. Park told her this sitting in his small office with the viewport that looked at the station's structure instead of the stars. He said it in a matter-of-fact way, but his hands were flat on the desk in a way that suggested he was working to keep his tone level. He said that the changes would affect thousands of students across dozens of species in the coming years. Laura said that was good. Park said yes, it was. The closing ceremony was held in the main assembly hall on Kareth Station, a large and formally arranged space that managed to feel both impressive and slightly cold, the way official places often do. The graduating cohorts from several programs were present, along with consortium representatives and a scattering of instructors in their formal designations. The human cohort sat together near the middle, cleaned up and presentable, Danny having somehow located a collar for his shirt that he was visibly uncomfortable with but wearing anyway. Each lead instructor gave a closing address for their cohort. It was a Velhari tradition that had been absorbed into consortium ceremony. A formal evaluation, brief and public, that was the instructor's final word on the group they had trained. Vale stood when it was her turn. She gave her address in English. The room noticed. The shift was subtle, but it moved through the assembly hall the way a change in air pressure moves. You felt it before you understood what it was. Velhari instructors did not address human cohorts in English. It was not a rule. It was simply not done. Vale did it anyway, standing at the formal podium with her hands at her sides and her dark eyes steady. She said that the human cohort had not been the highest-scoring group she had trained. She said this plainly, without apology, because it was true, and Vale did not soften true things. She said they were not the fastest or the most technically refined. She said there were cohorts in her record who had outperformed them on every measurable point. Then she paused for exactly 1 second. She said that the human cohort was the only group in her career in which every single member had completed the program. She said she had looked at her full record before writing this address, and she wanted to be accurate. In over 30 years of training, across more species than she would list here, she had never had a cohort with a completion rate of 100%. She said that the human cohort had demonstrated an attribute for which Velhari pedagogy did not currently have a formal classification. She said she had spent some time trying to name it accurately, because Velhari training did not like to leave things unnamed, and the closest she could arrive at was this: the ability to be hurt without becoming less. She said she was submitting a formal recommendation to the Consortium Curriculum Committee to begin developing a research framework around human psychological resilience, with the goal of understanding whether any part of it could be taught to other species or whether it emerged specifically from the conditions of human life. She said she did not know the answer to that yet. She said she intended to find out. Then she stepped back from the podium and the ceremony moved on. Danny leaned over to Laura and said in a low voice that he was fairly sure he had just been complimented and insulted at the same time, and he needed a moment to figure out how he felt about it. Priya, on Laura's other side, said quietly that in Velhari academic tradition, what Vale had just done was the equivalent of naming the cohort in her permanent record as exceptional. She said Soren had explained the full cultural weight of it to her the previous evening. She said it was, by Velhari standards, a significant thing. Danny thought about this for a second. Then he said, "So it was a love letter." Priya said she would not go that far. Danny said he was going that far. Laura didn't say anything. She was looking at Vale, who had returned to her seat and was sitting with the same precise stillness she always had. Hands folded, eyes forward, nothing on her face that gave anything away. But as the next speaker took the podium, Vale turned her head slightly, just slightly, and for a moment her gaze found Laura's across the room. She held it for 1 second. Then she looked away. It was nothing. It was barely anything at all. Laura looked back at the podium and listened to the next speaker. On the transport back to the Human Liaison Hub 2 days later, Commander Park sat across from Laura in the passenger hold. Outside the viewport, Kareth Station was already shrinking, the enormous layered structure growing smaller the way big things do when you leave them. Slowly at first, then faster than you expected, and then it was just a shape against the gas giant, and then it was gone. Park told her that the consortium had approved a second human cohort, larger than the first, 12 cadets instead of 9. He said the approval had come through faster than anyone in the liaison office had anticipated, and that several consortium members who had previously been neutral on the question of human participation had added their support after the review concluded. He said there was a specific request attached to the approval. He said the consortium had asked whether Laura Devon might be available to serve as a cultural advisor for the incoming cohort. Not an instructor, an advisor, someone who had been through the program, who understood the station, who could help the next group navigate the things that the official documentation didn't cover. He said she would have time to think about it. There was no rush. Laura looked out the viewport at the place where the station had been. The gas giant was still there, pale orange and slow turning, indifferent in the way only very large things can afford to be. She thought about Danny eating bad food in the cafeteria, and Priya with her grammar guide, and Soren explaining things in careful words because he wanted to be kind. She thought about a room going quiet in a particular way, and the specific weight of standing in the center of it and saying something true. She thought about what Vale had said, the ability to be hurt without becoming less. She thought about the next 12 people who were going to walk into that station not knowing what was coming, carrying whatever they were carrying, the way everyone carried something they didn't have a name for yet. She said she would think about it. She already knew the answer. Outside, the stars didn't move. They never did. You just had to be going somewhere for it to look that way.